You go to church on any given Sunday, you're probably going to hear some passage, some quote, some piece of scripture that was written by a guy named Paul. The Apostle Paul wrote more books of the New Testament than any other single author. He was extremely influential in Christianity. Where the New Testament has the Gospels, which are like the biographies of Jesus, the story of Jesus' life, Paul writes letters to churches, and he's explaining Christian theology, the Christian beliefs. He's explaining, what does it mean? Jesus came and lived and died and rose again. What does it mean to you? And so because he's written so much, and because he was so influential in the early church, he's commonly referred to, if you're going word by word through any book of the New Testament, even if it's a book not written by Paul, the pastor will probably reference something else from Paul that has to do with your topic. And if you're going topical, on this Sunday we're going to speak on a certain topic, I bet Paul is mentioned in some way. It's very common to see his writing, but the story of Paul is almost an apologetic unto itself. The story of Paul's life can tell us something today about the truth of Christianity. Now, Paul did not start off as a Christian. In fact, if you read the Gospels, the stories of Jesus' life, you won't see Paul in there. Paul is not somebody who associated with Jesus during Jesus' life. In fact, after Jesus' death, Paul is a Jewish leader. He is persecuting this early Christian church. They don't, the early Jewish leaders, they don't want this, what they believe is a twisting of Judaism, to spread. So they're actively persecuting Christians. There's a story in the book of Acts where a Christian is being punished for their Christian beliefs. The Jewish people are going to stone this Christian to death. And as they're going to do it, they're giving their coats to this guy, Paul. And Paul's hanging out of their coats for them while they conduct this stoning. Paul was very aggressive in trying to find Christians and persecute them. In fact, if you were a Christian in those first couple of years after Jesus' death, you would be fearful of Paul or somebody that Paul associated with coming after you. But then all of a sudden, Paul shows up to the Christian church and is telling them that he is a Christian. It is a overnight 180-degree change for Paul to go from this very hardcore persecutor of Christians to now claiming that he wants to be part of this Christian movement. And there's no Christians that in the community, the Christians that can point to say, who was it who convinced this guy? Who is it who talked to this guy about Jesus? And so everybody, the early Christians, were very concerned and skeptical of this guy, Paul, that he was really a Christian. In fact, Paul, he said, well, the only reason that I've changed my mind is that Jesus appeared to me personally. And I'm so convinced by my personal experience with Jesus, my eyewitness of Jesus living after his death, that I'm convinced Christianity is true and I want to understand it more and I want to be part of this movement. There's a ton of skepticism of this story, and you can imagine if you were these early Christians and this guy who was essentially hunting you is now saying he wants to be part of the team, you might not be very quick to accept him. But ultimately, Paul went and he spent some time with the apostles, the people who did know Jesus during Jesus' life, and they taught him about Christianity and what they had seen and experienced to Jesus. And Paul then goes on for the rest of his life and is a absolutely hardcore evangelist. He's going town to town and preaching Jesus everywhere he went. In fact, some of the earliest Christian literature that survives is written by Paul. The letters in the New Testament are some of the oldest Christian writings in general. And there's total scholarly consensus about certain ones of these books. If you look at the book of 1 Corinthians, for example, Christians and non-Christians alike, the scholars all agree that Paul wrote that letter in the early 50s. That would be about 20 years after Jesus died. So we know that Paul really did live close to the time of Jesus and really was a adamant defender of Christianity, even though he had been a persecutor. In 1 Corinthians, Paul even quotes earlier things that he was taught, earlier Christian beliefs. And the basics of the faith, that Jesus lived and died and rose again, Paul quotes something earlier than even his own writings, so we can know that these teachings that Jesus came back from the dead are very early in history. Essentially, these ideas that Jesus came back from the dead emerged essentially at the same time or shortly after Jesus died, as you would expect if he really did come back to life and people really saw him. Paul was persecuted then for the rest of his life for his Christian beliefs, and he spent numerous times in jail. In fact, the later letters of Paul are written while he's in essentially house arrest in Rome, awaiting some type of hearing for his beliefs. Even though he was a hardcore persecutor of Christians, Paul, for some reason, overnight has a 180-degree change and becomes one of the most passionate and influential Christian leaders from that day forward. And he's mentioned alongside all the people who actually knew Jesus, who lived and walked with him, like Peter, who was one of Jesus' disciples. Peter and Paul are talked about in the same breath because of the influence that Paul had. So I think there's two things that I see as big takeaways for Paul. One is that because he starts writing so early in history, we can know that the Christian teachings about Jesus are not legends that accrued over time. We know that within a couple decades, Paul is writing and he's quoting earlier beliefs. So we know that very shortly after the death of Jesus, they already believe that Jesus has these supernatural qualities, that he's come back from the dead, that there's salvation for sins through Jesus. The key teachings of Christianity immediately emerge in history, and Paul is documenting it for us so we can see this is not some legend about Jesus that comes over time. Jesus really existed in history, and he really did live a life like the life described in the Gospels. And secondly, I think it shows something about Paul's experience. Whatever Paul experienced that made him change his mind was so convincing that he went the rest of his life, and even though he faced persecution for his Christian conversion, he never wavered because of his personal experience. Now, he said that his personal experience was with the risen Jesus. And it would be hard to understand what other type of experience he could have had that would make him want to change. He started off as a Jewish leader who had some status in his community, who had certain Jewish beliefs that were different than Christian beliefs. Many of the things Jesus taught were kind of counterintuitive to the Jewish understanding of God. But he experienced something that made him feel that Christianity was true. Jesus really lived. I think it's more reasonable to take Paul at his word that he really experienced something in Jesus than to explain it in any other way, because any other explanation for this sudden overnight conversion seems to fail. If he had experienced something else that was not a genuine experience, I don't think that he would have lived the life that he ended up living, even enduring persecution, to the point where at the end of his life, he is in house arrest, just writing letters, trying to communicate what he can to people. And he's lost his status. He's lost his cultural heritage by the end. The life of the Apostle Paul it's extremely important for Christians to understand, because when we're reading these letters that are in the New Testament, we need to understand these are very early in history, written by a real person who I think we have very good reason to think had a true experience, a true religious experience of Jesus that was so convincing that the rest of his life he was committed to the cause. The Apostle Paul alone, just his life alone, should give us some reason to think, hey, this Christianity thing, I think this thing might be true. At the very least, his life alone should get us interested and willing to hear what Christianity has to say.